I'm Peter Robinson of Uncommon Knowledge. To honor the remarkable scholarship of Tom Sowell, renowned economist, social theorist, public intellectual, and Hoover Senior Fellow, we're inviting everyone inspired by his work to enter 2 national contests. The Thomas Sowell Essay Contest is open to high school students and college undergraduates. Students may explore a cultural issue or a policy issue through the lens of Tom Sowell's work, or reflect on how Thomas Sowell changed their view of the world. He certainly changed mine. I imagine he may have changed yours. The second contest, the Thomas Sowell Video Contest. This is open to everybody. It invites short, compelling videos up to 3 minutes that answer the question, what lesson or teaching from Thomas Sowell do Americans most need to learn or remember today? Winners of each competition will receive a $5,000 prize, along with paid travel and an invitation to a special celebration of Thomas Sowell that will take place here at the Hoover Institution on the Stanford University campus. All entries are due by August 31st. Let me repeat that date. That's an important one. All entries are due by August 31st. To learn more and apply, visit hoover.org/Thomas-Sowell-Legacy. hoover.org/Thomas Sowell Legacy. Thank you. Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, a great man or a misogynist and bigot? Historian Christopher Cox on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A native of St. Paul, Minnesota, Christopher Cox holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Southern California and both JD and MBA degrees from Harvard. Mr. Cox's government service was extensive. He served in the counsel's office in the Reagan White House, where we became friends. He represented a district in Southern California in the House of Representatives for 16 years, and he served as chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Since leaving government in 2009, Mr. Cox has practiced law in Southern California and turned 14 years ago to the writing of biography. Published late last year, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. John Greenleaf Whittier on Daniel Webster in an 1850 poem, so fallen, so lost, the light withdrawn which once he wore, the glory from his gray hairs gone forevermore. The Light Withdrawn.
The Light Withdrawn.
Why is that the title?
Comes from a poem. John Greenleaf Whittier was an abolitionist poet, and he was writing about an event that shook him and abolitionists throughout New England and really across the country, which was Daniel Webster, Senator Webster, abolition champion, letting them down, someone whom they had put all their faith in. And the question addressed and answered in the poem is, how do you react when a political figure that you have lionized and aggrandized and thought so highly of breaks your heart? And the answer, he said, is not to, pile on and not to be angry, but sad and humble, and recognize that everyone has, they're all human. Everyone has the opportunity to fail in various ways, and leaders,
and most of us take the opportunity.
Leaders do as well.
All right.
So it struck me, writing a century after Woodrow Wilson was on the scene, that kind of dispassion and empathy for him and also for the other people who challenged him during his career was the appropriate approach.
All right. Let's take a moment to establish just who Woodrow Wilson was. Wilson's dates, 1856 to 1924. He becomes a professor of what we would now call political science at the College of New Jersey, soon renamed Princeton. 12 years later, he's named president of Princeton. 8 years later, he's elected governor of New Jersey. And 2 years after that, in 1912, he's elected president of the United States, re-elected to a second term in 1916. Meteoric rise.
Absolutely.
What does Wilson accomplish during his 2 terms as president? Well, here's the conventional view. He reduces the country's reliance on import tariffs by introducing our first federal income tax. He establishes the Federal Reserve System. He creates the Federal Trade Commission, which enables the executive branch to regulate monopolies. He expands protections for organized labor and worker safety. He wins the First World War. He negotiates the Treaty of Versailles, for which he's awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And although he fails to bring the United States into the new League of Nations, his design for the League serves as a model for the United Nations, which the United States does join just over a quarter of a century later after the Second World War. Woodrow Wilson, stunning rise in politics, then one of the most consequential presidencies in American history. Christopher Cox, what the heck have you got against this guy?
Well, first of all, as we were just discussing with John Greenleaf Whittier's admonition to be humble as we approach these subjects of people who break our hearts. The people whose hearts were broken are all dead, as well as Woodrow Wilson is dead. But the people, in this case, who were let down were not only women in America, not only Black Americans, and the people who supported them, who were their allies, but more generally, it was the whole country that paid the price for this. And we who live decades later certainly see this in much more stark relief than we would have if we'd lived at the time. I mean, the people who were passionately invested in these issues, and there were many of them, certainly knew better than we can now what was at stake and how difficult it was. But this was a big issue that needs to be added to the list. So the list that you itemized is pretty well known. There have been many, many biographies of Woodrow Wilson. If you're going to write a new biography about a president who's been covered in literally over 1,000 books, you better have something new to say. What has been left out of the standard Wilson biography is his views on race and his views on sex. By the way, we call it gender today, but it was sex at the time, and it's sex in the Constitution.
Okay, so let's go straight to that then. From the light Withdrawn, Wilson and the Suffragettes. Quote, Wilson found teaching women history and politics, and here you quote Wilson himself, about as appropriate as would be lecturing to stonemasons on the evolution of fashion, close quote. Explain that remark. Explain the point.
Well, first of all, it's pretty straightforward. He doesn't think that women, girls, as he often called them, even though they were graduate students in many cases, in some cases plenty older than he was, but he didn't believe that they had any business studying the history of government or politics because they had no role, no civic role in participating in democracy that way. He had no trouble expressing these views in private. You started your description of his political career with Princeton. That was, that was his third stop as a teacher.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And he was 28 when he got his first paying job as a teacher. So there was a lot that happened before that framed his views. He was a child of the Civil War. He was a child of Reconstruction.
He grew up in?
He was born in Virginia, grew up till teenage years in Georgia. Then his family moved, and he moved with them to South Carolina. Then they moved to North Carolina. He then, as part of his schooling, went to the University of Virginia for 1 year of law school before he dropped out. He then, 3 years later, went to Atlanta to attempt to practice law, even though he didn't have a degree. That didn't work out either, so he quit that after a year. So a lot of formative time in the South, but particularly his years of living through Reconstruction were really important for Woodrow Wilson.
Okay, let's take a moment on that. His family, tell us about his family, the role they played in, well, where they stood during the Civil War, and what Reconstruction meant to a white Southern, well, to their family. Take a moment on that, if you would.
So Woodrow Wilson had very few friends as a child and as a teenager. but he was really strongly attached to his father. He hero worshipped his father. His father was a Presbyterian minister who went by Dr. Wilson in all quarters, even though he did not earn a doctorate anywhere. He got an honorary degree when he was a young man from a small college that nobody's ever heard of. Dr. Wilson preached to his segregated congregation that slavery, remember now we're talking about the pre-Civil War years
right
now, that slavery was sanctioned by God, that it was a benefit and in fact should be cherished by both the master race and by the inferior race. And the terms that he used are quite offensive to us today, but he had no difficulty expressing himself in this way. When the Civil War came, he turned his churchyard into an internment camp for Union soldiers on their way to Andersonville Prison, which is known today for its horrific abuses.
And this is, I'm trying to remember where this takes place because they moved from state to state in the South. This is in Virginia.
This is in Georgia.
Georgia, I'm sorry, Georgia.
Right.
All right.
After the Civil War and after the Reconstruction Amendments, which Wilson's father, strongly opposed, and we know that the son did too, because later on he wrote about this period in his History of the American People. He lived through it, and then he later wrote about it. So it's a wonderful thing for a biographer to have, that insight. Who knows what he really thought when he lived through these things, but we know because he told us. After the Reconstruction Amendments, Woodrow Wilson got to say that the 15th Amendment, which allowed black men to vote, was the ruin of the South. He said similar things about every aspect of Reconstruction, including the Freedmen's Bureau, which he thought that was encouraging laziness among the former enslaved people. He thought that they were owed nothing, apparently, as a result of being instantly turned loose on society without any training, having been the chattel of their owners. The Wilson family, and Woodrow Wilson grew up in this environment, had enslaved servants. He's the last American president to have grown up in a house with enslaved people. So these formative years for him caused him to believe that what was called universal suffrage, at first meaning black men can vote, ultimately meaning women can vote too, that universal suffrage was the cause of all of the nation's problems. And when he was a student at Princeton, he read things that he thought were very persuasive that made the same point.
All right. So if I could, I want to jump back here to Wilson as a sort of founder of the of what we think of as the progressive movement. So by the time he gets to Princeton, we want to hit the progressive movement, women's suffrage, and then come back to his attitude toward African Americans as president. Wilson writes, as I recall, I'm recalling now, he writes a senior thesis at Princeton, or what would soon be named Princeton, in which he's very dubious about the Constitution as it stood, and says things that suggest he really would favor something closer to the British parliamentary system, where the executive has central power that can carry whatever vote it wants to carry through the House of Commons. And then he says it more elaborately in work that he publishes. Is it in the History of the American Peoples? In any event, there's a body of thought. By the way, we should stipulate this man was extremely articulate.
Yes.
He wrote constantly. So we have a large body of work by him. And in all kinds of ways, it's tremendously impressive. It is an internally consistent body of thought, right?
He got this from his father.
Oh, is that so?
Yes, his father was
the loquaciousness,
a stickler for using just the right word. And one of the some people ask me, how do you stick with someone whose flaws you're writing about for 14 years as a biographer and a researcher, and without liking that part of them. But I really liked the parts in which Joseph Ruggles Wilson is instructing his son, their correspondence back and forth, and the obvious impact that it had on Woodrow Wilson. He was a great wordsmith.
All right. So he says in precise language, he lays out that he's extremely dubious of democracy, essentially, or of extending the franchise. And he seems to prefer, it's a kind of, what I'm trying to do is be fair to him without reading back onto him what we understand progressivism to mean today. So I'm tempted to say he was an early technocrat. Is that fair?
Well, I don't know.
Or am I reading something back into him?
I don't know that technocrat quite captures it. Wilson's views on race did not change much throughout his life. His views on women did change over time, but not so much his views on race. And to sort of race to the conclusion, when we get to the Anthony Amendment, the reason that Wilson, even though he was softened on the idea that women could be part of civic society, the reason that he opposed the Anthony Amendment was that it allowed black women to vote in the South. It would have brought federal enforcement to the South. It would have been another 15th Amendment, and he didn't like it for that reason. But his views need to be judged not by our times, not through what historians think of as presentism, but rather according to his times. And his holding out for as long as he did against women voting and his segregating the federal government were, for his own time, judged by progressives, many progressives, not all of them, because he had many racist progressives in his own administration, but judged by many progressives of the time, and certainly many progressive Republicans and people of all political stripes. His actions were way out there. He was an outlier.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I don't want to lose the point that you mentioned about his views on the structure of the government, because that relates back to Reconstruction.
Okay. So explain that, right.
He hated what happened when this domineering Republican Congress forced black people, black men, voting on the South. He thought that the South should be governed by its natural leaders, the superior white men. And, you know, it sounds like I'm picking on him, but these are his own words. And if you think about what he was proposing first in his very brief paper that he wrote as a senior in college, and then later on in congressional government, what he was proposing was a system that would have prevented the override of Andrew Johnson's vetoes of Reconstruction. He sort of reverse engineered the problem. Here was Andrew Johnson, who would have done the right thing, but here was the Congress that got in his way, and this Congress he described as despotic and dangerous. So the whole purpose of revising the Constitution, he wanted the president to be able to appoint the people who chaired the committees in the Congress. Only members of the president's party could introduce legislation, and on and on. The reason for this was
it would have protected the Old South.
He lived through Reconstruction, and it really formed a firm view in his mind that Congress is the big problem.
I see. All right. You go through incident after incident after incident in which he seems to be talking out of two sides of his mouth to the suffragettes. He seems to imply that he's with them, and then behind their backs or in correspondence, he undermines the suffrage movement, he delays it. So let's take just a moment to set up women's suffrage as an issue. As best I can tell, it emerges as a serious political issue after the Civil War, 1880s, 1890s, but by the turn of the century...
1860s.
1860s. Oh, it's right out, even during the Civil War?
Well, during the Civil War, in the sense that the women who became leaders of the suffrage movement were working in war work during the Civil War, and they were working before that as abolitionists. So the connection between the abolition movement and the suffrage movement is almost complete in those decades.
So is it fair to say that by the turn of the century, by the beginning of the 20th century, women's suffrage has become such a central issue in American politics that any politician of any national standing must declare on it. Is that fair?
Yes, at the turn of the century, that's absolutely true. There was a tipping point by that time. But to really put a fine point on the 1860s, when Congress was considering the 14th Amendment, it was then that the first amendments were introduced to include women in the franchise. So we have Samuel Pomeroy, Senator Pomeroy from Kansas, introducing one amendment at the time that the 14th, as you know, a proposed 14th Amendment. And then we have George Julian doing the same thing in the House. The 14th Amendment itself, not these separate bills introduced by these two men, in its first version that came out of the Joint Committee that was writing it, included women.
And so is it the correct way to think that women's suffrage is tied in the minds of the founders of that movement to black suffrage, to African, that this moment of liberation is to liberate African American men, but also women in their minds? Is that fair?
That's not only fair, that is
demonstrable.
That's a really important point.
Okay.
Because, you know, at the Seneca Falls Convention, now we're back to, you know, 1840s, and here we have Frederick Douglass. He's there at Seneca Falls, and he's speaking in behalf of women's right to vote. And then he takes his newspaper and runs on the masthead constantly a motto about not only race equality, but gender equality.
Okay, so these two go very, very much together. The light withdrawn. You've got incident after incident here of Wilson proving less than admirable, perhaps. Wilson claimed that as president, he was powerless to advocate for women's voting rights because he lacked the prior approval of the Democratic Party and its platform. It was not his place, Wilson insisted, to espouse any view not expressed in the platform. He was, he said, merely the party's spokesman. Then Chris Cox continues to say the transparent insincerity of Wilson's latest excuse made clear that his actual policy was ever-lengthening delay. What does he think he's doing?
Well, he thinks he's putting it off. He means to put it off. He also means to dodge a bullet. He doesn't want to, you know, come straight at the problem and say, ain't ever going to happen as long as I'm in the White House. This idea that...
So he's being a professional politician. He's maneuvering.
Yes, and I will actually give him credit because he was able to keep changing his story about why he opposed the Anthony Amendment for such a long period and got away with it. As a politician, using that word with all of its potential pejorative meaning as well, as a politician, he did more than passingly well. But the transparent insincerity comes from the fact that he had written, when he's writing about government, something very, very different about what the role of the president is. The president's role is not just to be the leader of his party, but to be the leader of the country. And the suffragists that came in to meet with him quoted those words back to him. They didn't for a moment buy what he was saying, and he didn't either.
All right. Okay. So let me give you a moment in history and a quotation. Here's the piece of history. It's not until 1919, this is the 7th year of Wilson's presidency, that Congress passes a women's suffrage amendment, and the Republicans give it more thoroughgoing support than do Woodrow Wilson's own Democrats. And as you note, at the time that this is enacted, Wilson is not even in the country. He's at the Paris Peace Conference. And here's the quotation from The Light Withdrawn. At the millennium, that is the turn of the 20th to the 21st century, the Gallup organization asked the American public to name the most important event of the 20th century. 66% chose, quote, women gaining the right to vote, ahead of landing a man on the moon and the fall of the Soviet Union. Only World War II ranked higher. Now, here's a quotation from the Wilson Center's Global Women's Leadership Initiative. I confess I'm not even sure what all that means, but here's what they have on their website. Wilson's voice proved unequivocal in the ultimate passing of the 19th Amendment. Wilson spoke fondly of its passage, saying that, now they're quoting Wilson, I deem it one of the greatest honors of my life that this great event should have occurred during my administration, close quote. So on an issue that Americans today believe one of the most important in our history, he's still seen by some as a heroic figure. What's the correct way? Give us, on this issue, how do we place this man?
Well, Wilson speaks truthfully when he says it happened during his administration. It happened at the very bitter end, and it happened after his party lost control of both the House and the Senate, and after he was forced by Democrats in his own party to change his view, literally the night before the House of Representatives, by 2/3 vote, approved the Anthony Amendment. He was dragged across the finish line.
All right. But good politician that he was happy to take credit for it when that served a purpose.
Yes, and that poll that you mentioned,
yes,
you know, it really is amazing that in all of the biographies that had been written about Woodrow Wilson, so little attention is paid to what at the time was the biggest domestic issue. We had World War I going on, of course, in Woodrow Wilson's second term. But even then, women's suffrage was fighting successfully with World War I, with the battles and all the losses and 1 million men, you know, in single battle and so on, fighting for headlines on the front page, and oftentimes kicked the war onto page 2.
I have to admit, I hadn't thought of it this way until just now, but the biographies that leave out his opposition to women's suffrage have to leave it out, at least in part because they've not done a thorough job of explaining his formation as a child of the South. That you bring something to bear on the question. I mean, there are certain reviews, you will have been aware of this by now, that say, deeply researched, meticulously written, but oh, for goodness sake, too much emphasis on women's suffrage, or too much emphasis on Wilson's failings. You've already made the point that this is what hasn't been treated and therefore needs correction.
It's a compliment to existing biographies.
All right. But at the same time, unless you understand, you cannot understand Wilson's formation, his intellectual formation and psychological formation as a child of the old Reconstruction South, unless you understand, well, the two go together.
Yes.
The two go together. If I'd rather not talk about his opposition to suffrage. No, you have to understand that to understand him. Correct?
I think that's right.
All right.
And it's not just that you know, he was a Southerner and that had an impact on him, and particularly in the time that he grew up, as we were discussing in Reconstruction. But it's that the movement for women's voting rights was from the first so closely connected with abolition and with race.
Right.
In the final act, Woodrow Wilson's opposition, as I mentioned a moment ago, to the Anthony Amendment was based on race. It was based on his deference to the Jim Crow states. He wanted to protect Jim Crow. And something that is newly discussed in this book that has not appeared in even scholarly articles to my knowledge was that even after his public expression of support for the Anthony Amendment, he then worked with Democratic senators from the South to rewrite the Anthony Amendment to protect Jim Crow, to get rid of that meddlesome Section 2 that said that the Congress shall have the power through appropriate legislation to enforce this act.
All right. So let's go right to Wilson on race. And again, this is immensely frustrating because we have here hundreds of very carefully researched and beautifully written words on Woodrow Wilson, and we're whipping through it, but this is a book and this is a different medium. We do what we can here. 1902, president of Princeton, Wilson publishes his History of the American People, which is not a minor work. 5 volumes,
although they're
minor volumes.
They're thin volumes.
Right, okay.
You might fit them into maybe not quite this book, but it's a substantial work, no question.
All right. This is you in the light Withdrawn, writing about Wilson's History of the American People. Wilson scolded Republicans for their sentimentality. They might believe granting civil and political rights to black citizens a sound policy, but it was only because they did not appreciate the humiliation, quoting Wilson, the white men of the South, would suffer by being put, quoting Wilson, under the Negro's heels. A government, quoting Wilson, sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes, placed an intolerable burden on the white men of the South. Wilson concluded it was plain to see that the troubles, again quoting Wilson, the troubles in the southern states arose out of the exclusion of the better whites from the electoral suffrage and the extension of the vote to, quoting Wilson, the most ignorant blacks, close quote. Well, you can see how somebody brings that up and the Princeton Board of Trustees has no choice but to take Woodrow Wilson's name off the formerly Woodrow Wilson School for International Studies, I guess. This is very shocking.
Yes, and the history of the American people is loaded with it. As you say, there are many incidents, many quotations in this book, but trust me, it's not the whole. My editors at Simon & Schuster said, "You've made the point." And I said, yes, but I don't want to be the one to make the point. Woodrow Wilson is the man who's going to speak in this book, not me. And so it's not ever in my voice. But even slimmed down in that way, I think it's overwhelming.
It's hard to take. Okay, so that's his thinking. He is a racist. He just believes in fundamental differences between people based on race.
Yeah, and it's
just this is
just
pure
a sort
old-fashioned.
of a thought experiment. We can say, let's try and remove all of the bad connotations of racism and just understand what it is. Because Woodrow Wilson and the people in his cabinet that he personally selected were happy to describe themselves as white supremacists. You know, these days, that's like nails on a chalkboard. You can't
Your
believe
career is,
that
whatever your
anybody
career
would
is, it's over at that
self-describe.
moment. Yes,
Yeah,
right.
I mean, unless you're
Right.
Adolf Hitler, you wouldn't be talking that way. But white supremacism was something that certainly Southern progressives, but Northern progressives, you know, in some instances as well. The Nation magazine, you know, wrote that they were happy to see that black people would now not be, you know, part of politics any longer. You know, so yeah,
It was there.
It's troubling, but it's real.
Wilson as president, again, the light withdrawn. You're talking here about a particular cabinet meeting in 1913. This is just after Wilson takes office. Quote, quoting you, "It was Postmaster General Albert Burleson who he said, time to introduce racial segregation not only within his department, but in all departments of government. It would be a great thing," he said, "and best for the Negro." Wilson agreed. Following the April 1913 cabinet meeting, racial segregation spread across the federal government. Methodically, the Wilson administration removed black appointees and replaced them with white men. A 2021 study of civil service records during the Wilson administration by the National Bureau of Economic Research revealed a consistent pattern of demotions that enabled white supremacists in the Democratic Party to institutionalize segregation and relegate black Americans to low-paying, low-prestige jobs. Okay, so again, all of this is very hard to take, but it's important to draw this distinction, which I think I grasp, but I put to you. Wilson is not simply reflecting the mores and racial understanding of the country as it stood at the time. He is imposing segregation. He is imposing racist views on a federal structure that until that point was, well, it wasn't perfect, but he moves it in a racist direction. There's no political pressure on him from the country at large to do this. Is that correct?
Yes. When a Boston newspaper editor, William Monroe Trotter, the first black Phi Beta Kappa key holder from Harvard, came and met with Woodrow Wilson.
This is Wilson as president.
Yeah, Wilson in the White House.
Right.
To complain because he had met with Wilson when he was a candidate, when he was still governor. He met with him in Trenton. And Wilson gave every impression that he was going to be completely fair to the race, as he called it. And Trotter, you know, walked out of that meeting. He said he was walking on air. So, you know, now fast forward a little more than a year, and here is Trotter in the White House saying, not until you occupied the White House has anything like this happened. For 50 years, white people and black people have been working alongside each other in the federal government. He also recounted how Wilson's predecessors had increasingly appointed black men to increasingly important positions, and Wilson had done nothing, in fact, pulled away some of those positions that previously black people had been appointed to. So judging Wilson by not only his own time, but the previous half century, he was reversing course.
All right. One other, just to draw, all of this is hard to take, but important. You talk about Wilson and his relationship with the movie Birth of a Nation, a 1950 film, silent movie, and I'm quoting you here. Birth of a Nation was punctuated with placards or title cards. It's a silent movie. One of these quoted Wilson's History of the American People. The card read, in Wilson's words, at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan to protect the Southern country, Woodrow Wilson, close quote. So give us a moment or two on the significance of that movie and Wilson's connection to the picture and to the director, to what it stood for at that cultural moment, if we may put it that way.
Yeah. So the quotation comes from that the movie took from Wilson's writings, comes from History of the American People, right. And it is surrounded in the History of the American People by other descriptions of the Klan that are very, very deferential. The Klan...
This is not plucked out of context unfairly.
I don't think so.
Right.
To the contrary. The reason that the movie was produced the way it was is that it is based on a book. The book was called The Klansman. The Klansman was a national bestseller, and its author was Wilson's friend and classmate from Johns Hopkins. So Thomas Dixon, that was his name, came to the White House, met with Wilson, said, I've been working with D.W. Griffith, who, by the way, was also son of the South, Confederate sympathies and that sort of thing in his family, and his view of the substance of Birth of a Nation, the record is fairly clear, it was the same as Dixon's and the same as Wilson's, although Wilson and Dixon expressed themselves very differently, so they're not the same person. Dixon was advising the president on cabinet appointments, and urged him to hire Josephus Daniels, who was one of the most racist people in the entire Wilson cabinet. That's saying a lot. So as a favor to Thomas Dixon, knowing full well what the story was, because it was this national bestseller, it had also been a stage play on Broadway. It ran at the Liberty Theater in Broadway, and it had more people, I think 500,000 people saw it at that one location, more people than seen anything there ever. And this is almost, a hop, skip, and a jump from Princeton, where Wilson undoubtedly saw it. The movie was just as controversial as the books had been. The books were riot breeders, the Broadway shows more so, and the movie most of all. Before it was shown in the White House, in Los Angeles, where it was first to premiere, the Los Angeles City Council was horrified by it. The New York Board of Censors was horrified by it. There are court actions hither and yon to try and join its showing because it was so horribly racist. And later on, after Wilson shows this movie in the White House, which really boosts its publicity, as you can imagine, he claimed, when a lot of pushback finally happened, that he really didn't know what the movie was about. But he never criticized the movie, and he was given many opportunities to do so, and people begged him to do so, and throughout his life, he never said a bad thing about the movie.
By the way, I can't resist noting that the man we once worked for, Ronald Reagan, born in 1911, And his father, who was not a man of any great education, but his father refused to permit Ronald Reagan and his brother, Moon Reagan, to see that movie. So it's not as if it was just properly educated people who understood that it was racist. Ordinary people understood it as well. It was controversial throughout the country.
Yes, and in the same way that Wilson's decision to segregate the government turned the clock back, so too did his sponsorship of this movie and the movie itself, because the movie normalized the Klan. It was a big, popular movie, seen by many, many more people than see movies today. Today we have television, we have other forms of entertainment, but that was it back then, and people sat in movie theaters that held 3,000 people and so on. And they had parties in New York with society matrons, dressed up in Klan costumes and that sort of thing. In the theaters, likewise, the ushers sometimes would dress that way. They sold a lot of tchotchke, Klan sorts of things. And in Stone Mountain, Georgia, the founder of the modern Ku Klux Klan, because remember the Grant administration basically did away with it, so it's been gone for a long time. Now it comes back, timed for the movie's opening in Georgia. And so say the people who founded it.
Okay, so this question, sorry, I want to go on to Wilson today, if that makes sense, but one last question on Wilson and race, and this question of following public opinion or leading public opinion, of advancing the clock or moving the clock back. Here's Frederick Douglass on Lincoln. And I'd like to ask you where Wilson fits into this, if he's simply a direct opposite. Frederick Douglass on Lincoln. And Douglass was cross with Lincoln, that's putting it mildly. Douglass was angry with Lincoln for many, many years because Lincoln was very slow to move against slavery per se. Lincoln's first declared war aim is to preserve the Union. And only in 1863 does he issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Frederick Douglass. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined, close quote. Is Wilson just the other way around? Is it as simple as that?
Yeah, I have to say that because Frederick Douglass featured so strongly in the early days of the women's suffrage movement as well as the abolition movement, I really formed a great appreciation.
He really is a kind of moral touchstone, isn't he?
In the research that I did. I mean, what an amazing person. And I think he there captures Lincoln properly, contextually, for all time. Wilson, I think if we're not looking at issues involving race or gender, might fare a lot better using that same metric. But we know from Wilson's own writings that he believed that a president is supposed to lead public opinion. He's supposed to be muscular. The people are supposed to be putty in the leader's hands. This is what he wrote. And then when it comes to this issue where there's a great tipping point when he arrives in Washington. Remember, we had this big suffrage parade the day before he was sworn into his first term. This enormous suffrage parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. So that's his moment, and he held back the tide for almost 2 terms.
All right. By the way, we just have to get in this, the final illness, because of course it's in everybody's mind today. Wilson's health. In late 1919, he returns from Paris to Washington. I'm going to quote you on this episode, The Light Withdrawn. Wilson suffered a massive stroke. His left arm and leg were paralyzed, the left side of his face drooped, and his digestive problems became acute. He could no longer read, sit in a chair to eat, or sign his name. Edith, Wilson's wife, went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the president's disability. For over 4 months, Wilson remained in seclusion. One of Wilson's aides recorded in his diary in late January 1920, he, the president, he cannot know what is going on. He sees almost nobody and hears almost no direct views. Was there ever such a situation in our history? Close quote. So, of course, now we have the 25th Amendment, ratified in 1967, which is supposed to give us, lays out quite straightforwardly the means for dealing with an incapacitated president. Are the two cases simply so different? Wilson's debility was extreme. Joe Biden's is a creeping incapacity of age. Were the times so different that there's no point, there's nothing we can learn by comparing the two? Or are there lessons to be drawn?
Well, there's certainly cognates of one another. There's health issues involved in both. What I'd say about the Wilson piece of that comparison is that it's well known, first of all, what happened to him and how badly he was affected, both physically and mentally. Mm-hmm. But you have to tack that on to his physical absence from the country for 6 months prior to that.
Of course, because he was in France.
He left on 2 occasions for roughly 3 months each, over 6 months all told. He left the United States of America, went to Europe at a time when transatlantic communication was, very, very primitive. There was an undersea cable, and we had Morse code, and you had to, tap, tap, tap every character and so on. And so all of the messages were, using the perfectly appropriate word, cryptic, very short. It's not as if, you could send a bill overseas and the president could decide after reading it whether he wished to sign it or not, or a lengthy memo discussing any subject. He was basically cut off from America, and he really was cut off sometimes when he was at sea. The journey took, 10 days to 2 weeks each way, because ship-to-shore telephony was in its infancy, and radio communication was often either tied up by the navigators or disturbed by weather or what have you. So literally sometimes you just couldn't reach him at all. And then there's a 6-hour time difference to Paris and so on. He was paying attention only to the League of Nations and his personal items of interest in the peace negotiations when he was over there. And all of the domestic problems of the United States, we didn't have a president. And Congress, wasn't in session because he refused to call them into session after he lost control of Congress. He didn't want them. He was making recess appointments. He didn't have to have judges or cabinet officers or anybody voted on by the Senate. He didn't want them conducting oversight of how he conducted the war. And so Congress was shut down by the president. So here we have from, essentially the end of 1918 until March of 1921, I almost said 2021, the country operating without a president.
Wow. Should he have resigned?
Yes.
Do we hold that against him?
Yes, and you didn't need the 25th Amendment to know that. There was a process.
And Marshall was his vice president. Would he have been up to the job?
Well, I think
he wasn't ill.
Historians would say no, but they would have said that about Truman if he hadn't become president. Sometimes people surprise us. I think having a sentient being in charge rather than someone who is watching movies all day, as Wilson was at the end, would have been a big improvement.
All right. Barton Swaim's review of The Light Withdrawn in the Wall Street Journal. At the core of progressivism is the belief that most people lack the wisdom to govern themselves and require a class of educated elites to organize society according to a shifting set of ideals. Wilson's warped ideas on race and sex weren't departures from progressivism, but variant expressions of it. Close quote. So how much do progressives today, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, owe to the example of Woodrow Wilson?
Well, I hope they take as little as possible from the example of Woodrow Wilson on items of gender and race. But progressivism writ large, has in the brand of Woodrow Wilson built in.
It really does, doesn't it?
Woodrow Wilson, the brand, I'm saying,
all right.
Not because Woodrow Wilson was the best expression of progressive ideals, but because he was president of the United States, and a lot of other progressives who didn't agree with his elitism were not. So for better or for worse, what progressivism is and what it's understood to be is very much influenced by Woodrow Wilson's own approach to the thing. And Woodrow Wilson was nothing if not an elitist. He was absolutely, as Bart Swaim describes, of the view that we know best and so on. And when you look at his view of whether black people should be entitled to vote or to participate in even normal social arrangements in the United States, he believed that white men were superior, and that was as obvious to him as the sun. So it's probably accusing progressivism of all of Wilson's personal sins to say that his brand of elitism is baked into the whole notion of progressivism. I think you and I, if we had another hour, could come up with a long list of progressive objectives that we think are worthwhile. So, unless we're being...
Should progressives today harken back, attempt to rebrand themselves as Teddy Roosevelt progressives?
Well, I think, I never was party to the discussions when they decided to go from liberals to progressives.
Yes.
I thought it was an odd choice because it's sort of intentionally picking up all this baggage.
Yes.
There were good things about progressivism and there were bad things about it. It's an historical thing. There was a progressive party. There were progressive Republicans. You can go look it up. And why you would want to own all of it when you're trying to represent yourself to a 21st century audience, I'm not sure.
All right. Let me return to Wilson's accomplishments. He lowers tariffs, institutes the federal income tax. I'm not too happy about that, but it was a big thing. He establishes a central bank. He wins the First World War, negotiates the Treaty of Versailles. And again, although he fails to persuade the Senate to take us into the League of Nations, the League serves as a model for the United Nations. So the argument would be that despite his flaws, and he was a man of his upbringing, which was that of the post-Civil War South, despite his flaws, he is rightly considered a great president.
Well, the question of how to weigh Wilson,
that's where I am.
The president of the United States, not the man necessarily, but the 8 years he had in the Oval Office, in terms of his predecessors and successors as president, in other words, the rankings, is one that even after 14 years of research, I don't feel competent to address, because I have a special focus in writing this story that's fundamentally about women's suffrage. And on the metrics that I chose, Wilson was not successful. He was actually taking the country in the wrong direction, according to the lights of people of his own time as well as ours. But I also had trouble squaring, if you created the National Park Service, which he did, if you got the Clayton Act signed, if you did tariff reform, many of these things, even creating the Federal Reserve, are procedural things. How do you compare that with flunking the test on human rights? One is just much more morally infused than the other. So it's apples and oranges. And I can't say, well, he did these 12 good things and these 5 bad things and come up with an algorithm that says, therefore, she should be ranked 17th.
Okay. You're refusing to rank him. It's pretty devastating.
This is not for lack of trying.
Yeah, okay. All right.
And it's not the first time I've been asked the question, but I honestly don't have a satisfactory answer to that one.
Okay. Last question. Claire Booth Luce. Do you remember Mrs. Luce? She spent her last few years in Ronald Reagan's Washington.
I do, although I did not know her personally.
All right. Claire Booth Luce used to say that history would give even the greatest figures just one sentence. Lincoln freed the slaves. Churchill saved Britain. What's the sentence for Woodrow Wilson? I'll give you 2 sentences, Chris, since we've known each other for a long time.
I can be pithy.
All right.
For better or for worse, he brought us into the modern world.
All right. That is wonderfully ambiguous. Christopher Cox, author of Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. Thank you.
Thank you. It was been great fun talking with you.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.